So in the final versions of the advanced macro policy modeling course, and so just so that if people are in the wrong room, I remember going to university and people would walk in and the professor would ask, "Are you in the right room?" So question is, are you in the right room? So advanced macro policy modeling. Um, this is we're getting. There's only going to be two more sessions left. And in these last sessions, we're going to be getting into the global integrated monetary fiscal model, which was one of the multi-country models that was developed with me and a bunch of co-authors at the International Monetary Fund. I'm going to be going into who actually was involved in that project once we get into the details. Now, why are we interested in those types of analytical frameworks? We're in the process of rewriting everything from scratch, um, including the software, but including the theoretical parts of the model, doing them in continuous time. GIMP was done in discrete time, but in addition, GIMP basically, as we're going to show, just ran out of space to develop because of analytical tractability issues. So in the models that I'm developing now with HiCAS, Gitian, um, and Vosgen and Shalva, these are people at the Central Bank of Armenia and the National Bank of Georgia, um, as well as Hamid Farouque, who basically did the early work with me in the 1990s, developing the foundations of all these multi-country DSG models, which are basically extensions of Olivier Blanchard's work. But I'll be getting into that later. Now, why do we care? Um, well, for the very same reason that Charles Goodhart cares. There's a number of very interesting issues that's going to be with us for many, many years. So on March 5th, Tuesday, 2 o'clock, Lisbon time, 6 p.m., Yerevan and Tbilisi time, we are going to be going through the Charles Goodhart research agenda. And that research agenda is going to be relevant, not just for this year and next year, but possibly the next 50 years or maybe even longer than that. They deal with issues that have different layers. One layer is demographics and aging. So, for example, Olivier Blanchard has pointed to aging as being one reason why he thinks that the equilibrium real interest rate has been on a declining trend, and why we might go right back into that world where central banks are constrained by the effective lower bound on interest rates, and that would be pretty problematic along a number of dimensions. It would bring up the risks of things like Fisherian deflations because of central banks being constrained by the effect of lower bound on interest rates. So Fisherian deflation, we mean, Great Depression economics and so on. And you can imagine countries like Japan or Korea that are facing enormous aging issues. In Japan, for example, over 10% of the population is over the age of 80 and so on. So demographic trends are the first layer. Aging, but not all the countries are aging. As we're going to see on March 5th, we're going to try and show you some initial results with GIMP, where we look at the implications of aging in Japan, but then also look at what the options are for the Japanese authorities and other countries like Japan in terms of getting access to foreign labor. So in that particular example, it's going to be from the Philippines and so on, but also using technology. Okay, so The way we think about those three layers are layer one, demographics, aging, layer two, what we call migration economics. Okay, but it doesn't have to be migration in terms of necessarily living in in Japan. It could be that you have a work permit system where you import labor to help you take care of old people. So then the third layer is technology, and so you can think of this as robots. Um, uh, can we use labor saving technology in different sectors of the economy to replace the labor in those economies where they're facing shortages in particular types of skills. And for example, skills to take care of elderly people will be a combination of high skilled labor and lower skilled labor. And so, how will technology be used to efficiently deal with the problem of declining labor supply? And so, how can robots or artificial intelligence? So, three layers, but there's also another layer that I've been thinking about, and that is energy. And the reason is that when we go back to our standard models based on Robert Solow's work, energy kind of dropped out of the equation, and the importance of energy dropped out of the equation because we could, in conventional macroeconomics, we think of the importance of energy as being mainly related to how important energy is as a share of the value of overall goods and services in the economy and so on. And that might not be the case because when an important and reliable source of energy is required to basically automate things with technology like robots, we will need to have the right kind of energy supporting those technologies. And if one thinks about that, you would say it's not just energy; it's in general natural resources. So all the resources that are required to make things like computer chips and so on. We have computer chips everywhere. Uh, in the computer, in my phone, in my virtually everything is sitting on my desk has chips in it. Okay, and the question is, so you could say the fourth layer is energy, or you could just say it's natural resources, which are going to be critical if we start thinking about using and designing specifically machines and technology to deal with declining labor problems. So March 5th, 2 p.m. London time, we are going to launch the Charles Goodhart Hour. So it's going to be every Tuesday. We're not just going to focus on this issue because we're mainly interested in monetary policy and macroprudential types of issues in that Tuesday seminar, but this will feature prominently from time to time. So as our research develops in this area, we will use the Tuesday seminar as well as the Better Apology Project seminar on Thursdays, same time, 2 p.m. London time and 6 p.m. Yerevan and Tbilisi time. The Thursday seminars are chaired by Governor Gelstian of the Central Bank of Armenia and Deputy Governor Armen Nurbekyan from the Central Bank of Armenia. Okay, so let's get in a little bit into GIMP. So again, if this quote is relevant on everything we do. So I'm going to be talking about modeling today. And so it's very important for people to understand and for our students to understand what distinguishes us at the Global Forecasting School and other people that use these kinds of models and so on. So I have an expression, never say the model says. And unfortunately, when people come out of school, that's what they're taught. They're taught basically to build models and to figure out what the answers are from these models, and that's okay. That is, I'm not against that, but there has to be a clear recognition that a policymaking institution has to function on a much higher level. We can't have elevator economics, and unfortunately, if you don't have a training program in your institution that takes these people from school and trains them how to be professional economists and not do elevator economics, you will end up with what a lot of major policymaking institutions have right now. So I'm going to use this quote, use it, virtually everything we do, but I'd rather have Bob Solow than an econometric model. Okay, full stop. I don't want any econometric models unless I have Bob Solow like economists and so on. So today I'm going to be talking about the global integrated monetary fiscal model. And I'm going to tell you what its strengths and what its weaknesses are. Its only strength was the fact that there was Ben Hunt that was managing to a large extent the project and making sure that the design of it and the calibration of it made sense. In other words, was consistent with the available evidence and that sort of stuff. But unfortunately, GIMP, as well as lots of other models, were given again to people without sufficient training to be professional economists that use them as kind of number crunching machines, and that's incredibly regrettable. I have another great thing about GIMP. Olivier, a lot of these models were developed under the leadership of some really great economic counselors. I would say, starting with Michael Musa, who was the first director of the research department when I went to the IMF in 1993. And the models we were developing then were things like multi-mod and so on. And so Mike wasn't really a big, so yeah, I wouldn't say he was very keen on models, but he was very keen on us doing research, independent research, and he recognized that models were a part of that. But back then, the entire multi-country modeling project was myself. Initially, it was Steve Szymanski, but then it was literally about half my time, because half the time I would be doing monetary policy analysis and that sort of thing, and a research assistant, a very incredibly skilled research assistant, Susanna Ursula. So the two of us together did most of the multilateral surveillance, before we hired Ben Hunt and started to put together a big team. And then what happened is a bunch of people came in. Raghu Rajan was one of them. Ken Rogoff came and asked me to build a model of new open economy macroeconomics. And so I did that with Paulo Picenti. We did it in 6 months. That's the global economy model. And it basically had, I would say, every bell and whistle you can imagine. Unfortunately, those style of models have infected our central banks enormously. And I'm gonna be talking in this presentation about the problems in those infinite horizon representative agent models, because GIMP is going to be based on overlapping generations. But these infinite horizon representative agent models have infected central banks. And, the clear sign of that is that when you see people present them, when they say that here's 40 other institutions that are doing that, that's a clear sign that you've lost your way, that there's not anything really creative, and you have to defend what you're doing on the basis of because other people are doing it. But the big problem is that they don't have economists that have developed these models, and as a result, they're using them as kind of number crunching things where they're producing absolutely ridiculous results and so on. Okay, so I'd rather have Bob Solow than an econometric model, full stop. But I'd rather have Bob Solow with an econometric model than without one. And what we mean by that is that for a great economist, like Bob Solow, when you're doing economics, sometimes depending on what the question is, you'll be doing something very simple. You'll be choosing the economics for the type of question that you're dealing with. But what you always hope to do at the end of the day is to be able to explain your results intelligibly using some structured reasoning, what we call economics. And how to explain that? If you go back to the debates between, I would say, Franco Modigliani and Milton Friedman, very fun things back when we had real economists in the profession. Now, it's true that they were picking low-hanging fruit and so on, right? But if you go back and read the debates between people like that, they would argue about many, many types of issues, but they would all agree that they're doing economics, and it's not even clear, given how we've lost our way in the profession for teaching macroeconomics, how whether or not I would even describe it as economics is a bunch of elevator economics, and it's not up to very good standards. So I'd rather have Bob Solow with an econometric model than without one. So on that note, we use the dynamic learning environment. Okay, so what that means in terms of teaching is that I'll cut a video like this, and then the students have to take that video, internalize the information, and then start teaching what it is they've learned and so on. So this means that the teacher, in my case, me, gets feedback very quickly. We don't wait for them to sit down and take some exam months later or whatever. The day that they observe the information, they have to cut videos and send them to me, showing what it is they've learned. And then, of course, we also, to increase the productivity of learning, we follow what are called double days. And so what that means is that when we focus on a particular issue, like the one I'm going to focus on today, they'll focus on that all day long, and then they also do it the next day as well. And why? Well, because the evidence strongly shows that basically when you try to learn something very intensively on day one, you have to follow it up the next day, because if you do that increases your retention rate enormously. And so we double that again. So we do 3 days of dynamic learning environment where they go through the lecture material. They can ask me questions, and they're obviously talking about it, discussing it. But it's a 3-day thing where you do it the next day to ensure that your retention rate is really super high, that you've truly internalized it and can teach it. And we do it an additional day. We double it up again. So that's what it means. Okay, now previous lectures we went through models with endogenous money creation, and at the end of that, we concluded that we need more heterogeneity to get into the serious modeling of this stuff for supporting things like macroprudential policy analysis. But from the simple models that we developed in 2014, this is joint work with Jaromir Benish and Michael Kumhof. The insights of those models can be used for analysis every day, and so on. So we went through that stuff very extensively about what endogenous money creation means and so on. So today we will, and then we also went into stock flow relationships, and so that was one of the lectures that the students have actually worked through to understand the basic insights of stock flow relationships for thinking about all kinds of issues. Okay, so global integrated monetary fiscal model. So this is, if you want to look at two papers, the first one is a more practical paper where you can look at things like the properties of the model. In other words, we do a bunch of fiscal shocks and other types of shocks, and you look at the basic properties of a model like the global integrated monetary fiscal model. Again, please make sure that you have a driver's license to run these models. I'd actually prefer it that people that don't think like an economist, that they wouldn't use these models. Okay, so it's not the models that are assets. It's the human capital that goes into the people that use these models as tools, much like construction workers use hammers to build houses. I have no idea why economists think that actually the hammers build houses by themselves. So please don't use any of these models. If you're an elevator economist, please go and use somebody else's models. Okay, so now the theoretical structure of the model is in this 2010 working paper. As we're going to see, it's done in discrete time, and as a result of that, the equations are not very elegant and particularly intuitive. But I'll go through them as best I can. You can also go onto the Better Policy Project website, and there'll be a list of research. Okay, so what does GIMP stand for? G for global, I for integrated, and M and F for monetary and fiscal model. Now, just to be clear about that, this is going to be an annual model, and it would fall in what is branded nowadays as micro-founded. Okay, but I'm going to take you through that, what people call micro-founded, and you can decide for yourself how useful that is. What precisely we mean by micro-founded today, because it looks more like reverse engineering to get some simple equations, and that's okay. But if your standard, for economic modeling was maybe David Hendry reduced form econometric model, if it was that truly that clueless, if that was the kind of modeling you were doing, okay, then you might say that this is extremely insightful if it stopped you from doing that kind of nonsense. Okay, but at the very same time, if you were a critical thinker and you were thinking about micro foundations as being something that you would relate to micro data, okay, that's not what we mean by micro-founded. What we mean by micro-founded here is simply just being able to do some dynamic optimization theory to be able to write some equations down. And I should say, up front, this is annual. And so obviously it can't really be a serious model of monetary policy because monetary policy has to take place at a much higher frequency than monthly. So you should know that, when we talk about global integrated monetary fiscal model, we mean broad brush, simple story about monetary policy. But the decision to to keep it annual was an extremely wise decision because anybody that tries to model um, at higher frequencies with this kind of approach is just likely to get nonsense, and that's your micro-founded DSG, infinite horizon representative agent models that all these central banks now are estimating. And you should just look at them and know the structure is impossible to take to the data in any serious way. The monetary transmission mechanisms are simply way too forward looking. Like it's insane that some people would think about estimating that model to find the parameters to tell people what the answer is. So that's how naive that stuff is. But it is equipped with a large assortment of nominal and real rigidities, and of course a monetary reaction function, which of course we don't think makes a lot of sense when we do real time monetary policy analysis. Standard now is to use an objective function for monetary policy, like what we showed in advanced macro policy modeling one. But it is equipped, and this is the strength of GIMF, with what we describe as multiple and powerful non-Ricardian features. So I'm going to show you the difference in an infinite horizon representative agent model and what we have here. And of course, if the interest rate is above the growth rate of the economy, which it is now, you have to have a fiscal policy reaction function that adjusts the primary balance sufficiently aggressively to anchor debt dynamics. And so that insight of these models is very, very important. And it's very important nowadays because fiscal policy, given extremely high levels of government debt and the fact that we still have deficits, primary deficits in countries like the United States, has put us on a trajectory where that could be extremely dangerous, not just in the United States, but very, very problematic for countries like Italy. That's a member of a monetary union, and has a debt to GDP ratio that is so high that the ECB would not be able to allow interest rates to rise above some critical threshold. So this is some work that Vosgen and I are doing, looking at the corridor theory of the corridor for interest rates getting narrower and narrower because when you get hit by the effective lower bound, you have to use unconventional policies in fiscal. That results in asset price bubbles and high levels of debt, government debt. And of course, when the economy then normalizes and goes to high interest rates, then you get this real big problem because if the interest rate rises above the growth rate of the economy, like what we are observing now, then you get unstable fiscal dynamics, and of course that puts the central bank into a position where they can't raise the interest rate above some critical threshold, and that means monetizing um, the economy so that you can get enough inflation to reduce the real value of debt to start the game over again. And of course, this is going to be incredibly problematic for Italy in a monetary union. They didn't really think out very well Europe when they designed it, but the idea that you would have a monetary union without having a fiscal union, and of course you can't really have a fiscal union; it's impossible unless you have a political union. So the European project is they were missing a good monetary economist on the design of the European project. It was incredibly unwise to think about creating a monetary union without that. Japan, again, I've been talking about Japan. When we think about this aging problem in Japan and Korea and countries like that, we have to think about three C's policies. In other words, monetary, fiscal, and structural policies, which is going to be very much wrapped up into this aging stuff. You have to think about those all those policies together and so on. So okay, so back to GIMP. There's going to be four reasons for what we call Ricardian equivalence to break down. Now, this is this is kind of funny. Maybe David Ricardo wouldn't think it was so funny because David Ricardo was anything but a Ricardian in the sense that David Ricardo was very concerned about the effects of the government running deficits. In other words, spending more than the tax revenue that they brought in. Okay. And the reason that David Ricardo was concerned about that is that if you did that, there would be a tendency for excessive consumption. So, in other words, so what we mean by Ricardian equivalence is that we've got these dynastic households. This is totally nuts what I'm going to tell you, but it is an assumption that is in these models, just to show how nutty they are. But so what Ricardian equivalence is that if the government runs deficits, in other words, if they have higher expenditures today than taxes, so you can think of it as just a tax cut. So the government goes out and they tax people less and run a deficit. Well, that is going to accumulate into higher levels of debt. And so in the future, they're going to have to raise taxes to finance the interest obligations on that debt. Okay, so if you were a dynastic household that cared all about future, all your future children's children, and you operated like a dynasty, you would change your saving rate 1-for-1 with the reduction in government saving. So in other words, if the government runs a deficit, I'm going to say, well, they're saving less, okay, or they're spending more than they're bringing in tax revenue. And so when the government dissaves in a world where you have dynastic households that care about their future children forever and their children's children and so on, you will just adjust your saving rate. You'll increase it to basically internalize what we describe as the future budget constraint. So you know that taxes are going to be higher in the future. And so you save the tax cut today to pay for the higher taxes in the future. David Ricardo didn't believe that. He was because he thought that didn't make any sense whatsoever. He argued against deficit spending or governments running deficits. And the reason is that in the real world, what he thought was if you cut taxes, the people that will be getting the lower taxes today are not going to save for the future generations. They're going to spend it. And of course, that takes us into these beautiful models. I should tell you, these models are truly beautiful relative to infinite horizon representative Bayesian models. because they contain this basic insight that back to David Henry about how bad that stuff is. So one of the things that he used to say is that we know more about the long run than the short run. Rubbish. We don't observe the long runs. What we observe is tension in the dynamics of the short run. And the other thing that he recommended was that you can think about modeling the long run, the equilibrium that you're, and then model kind of cycles around that. Rubbish again, because one of the major insights from this kind of logic that goes all the way back to David Ricardo is that basically the same mechanisms that give rise to crowding out and non-Ricardian behavior in the short run are exactly the same mechanisms that will give rise to what are the longer run effects of government debt. So one cannot one cannot separate the understanding in some situations about the long run comparative statics of an experiment where the government reduces taxes and builds up government debt. And of course, then those interest payments on that higher level of government debt needs to be financed. So one cannot separate the things that determine the dynamic response or the short run response from the medium term response from the longer term response. You have to think in terms of the same fundamental parameters that are driving both the short run. So obviously, one is how much myopia there is, or another way of putting it is how disconnected are the generations that are getting the lower taxes today from the generations that are getting the higher taxes in the future to service the higher interest payments on the debt. And so that parameter fundamentally is how myopic your population is, or how little they care about future generations. That parameter will depend when the government starts partying. How much does the private sector party? In other words, how much does it spend? And of course, how much it spends will influence how high interest rates and exchange rates have to adjust when the economy is experiencing full employment. Okay, because this is principally full employment economics that we're talking about, general equilibrium theory. So, how high does the interest rate have to go, or how high does the exchange rate have to appreciate to contain these demand forces? And then, of course, how high the interest rate goes influences the capital stock, and that influences potential output in the medium and longer run. So there, again, this crazy, so these models are incredibly insightful if you're at the level of doing economics, elevator economics, like David Hendry and Muehlbauer and people like that have never built a model, never built a model, but profess to comment on it. They've never entered the game. They've never done anything useful, but they comment on how we should be doing models, not having any expertise, any relevant experiences. And some central banks listen to these people. So from that perspective, these models are incredibly insightful, especially insightful. But even for people that are into infinite horizon representative agent models, like Michael Kuma, for example, who was the guy that did math for this particular model. When he started working on this economics, having worked on infinite horizon representative agent model, he thought this is economics, and I agree, this is economics, like David Ricardo and so on. So, what are these sources of non-Ricardian features? Remember what we mean by that now, right? That David Ricardo wasn't Ricardian. So there's going to be three. So when the increases in taxes to finance the higher interest obligations on the debt, when they fall on on the types of income streams where people could be responding to it. So this is what we refer to as distortionary taxes. So if taxes are higher on capital, which we usually consider to be a very distortionary tax, because when you're taxing capital, we need capital to produce output. And so taxing capital is like taxing output. And so if you have government running deficits and that's accumulating into higher levels of debt, if you're going to need higher taxes on capital, well, that's going to reduce capital and that's also going to reduce the amount of output. Okay, so distortionary taxes. That's also true of taxing labor, particularly when the tax rate, the marginal tax rate, gets really, really high. So when you have economies with extremely high levels of debt, good example would be the United Kingdom. There's a wonderful little manuscript by Milton Friedman on curing the British disease, and he actually talks about back when marginal tax rates were just gigantic, and so obviously when that happens, the labor is going to reduce their labor effort, or they might even leave the country. I'm a Canadian, and so we benefited enormously from the bad economic policies in the United Kingdom. We got a bunch of doctors from the UK because the UK would train them back in the 1970s and so on. And of course, the tax rate was so high they'd say, well, geez, we can go to Canada. We can have a really good life because we don't have to pay these really crazy marginal tax rates. So once your income gets up above a certain level. So distortionary taxes. So obviously, consumption taxes are going to be less distortionary than in terms of output. And so if you're in a situation where your debt dynamics are unstable and so on, you don't want to be taxing output because you need more output. But you could tax consumption, and that could potentially have less effects on the production of output, less distortionary, and so on. But what you'd really like uh, is to find taxes that are not distortionary. And so a good example of a tax like that would be a poll tax. You just tax people. You don't discriminate by their income level. And the problem with that, of course, is equity considerations. That some of these people might be poor, and so on. So there's going to be trade-offs between equity considerations from taxation and the efficiency. But that's a reason for non-Ricardian behavior that if the government runs deficits, it's going to require higher taxes in the future, and those higher taxes could discourage work effort or capital or things that are factors of production. Also, the exchange rate in an open economy, if you run a government deficit when the world is non-Ricardian, okay, again, when I use that word non-Ricardian, Ricardo wasn't Ricardian. Okay, so don't forget that because David Ricardo would probably be upset at how we're actually using these terms. But in a non-Ricardian world, correctly interpreted, where government deficits result in an excessive consumption. In open economies, if the government can borrow and lend at an unchanged interest rate from the rest of the world, in other words, the increase in government deficits isn't so large that it requires an increase in the country risk premium. In that case, net foreign liabilities are going to increase. So you're going to end up owing the world more. So the government debt is going to show up as an increase in net foreign liabilities to the world. And of course, for there to be a steady state, the real exchange rate is going to have to depreciate. And it's going to have to depreciate to generate a trade balance surplus that's sufficient to pay the interest obligations on the higher level of net foreign liabilities, like the fact that you owe foreigners money, there's going to be a natural interest payment to them. And so within the trade account, it means that you're going to have a depreciation to consume less foreign goods and to encourage foreigners to buy your goods. And how does that happen? When demand curves slope down, supply curves slope up, you have to have a lower price. So your real exchange rate has to depreciate. And so for many economies, that will raise the cost of capital, much like a higher real interest rate raises the cost of capital, the more expensive capital goods that could also have non-Ricardian effects. Okay, so the other thing, of course, is liquidity constrained agents that don't have access to financial markets. So these are just agents that consume out of their disposable income. They can't borrow, and so they just follow. They're sometimes referred to as rule of thumb consumers. And then, importantly, or just as importantly, people that have life cycle income profiles. And so in these models that have overlapping generations, just as the work of Frank Modigliani and Milton Friedman argued, when you look at real world consumption behavior, the life cycle features of household are very, very important. So it's like they plan, for the resources that they have available over their lifetime. So they don't save deliberately. Most of the population, to like a dynasty would save that cares about all future generations. They don't save that much. They save some, and that's mainly because they're free to live. The hazard of living means that you have to have a bunch of resources on hand to make sure that if you live, that you can also eat and be taken care of, and so on. So the life cycle income patterns are very, very important for the agents in the economy that don't just consume out of their income, but also plan for their retirement and so on. In addition, these overlapping agents that we have are going to have what are referred to as finite lifetimes. So this is builds on the work of Olivier Blanchard's 1985 paper in the Journal of Political Economy, where he did some very nice analytical work that Hamid Faruqi and I in the 1990s then extended. Nice thing is it's in continuous time, so it's very elegant, very intuitive to look at. And what's neat about this is that it basically just raises the subjective discount rate so that one could get much more plausible effects of interest rates on consumption and saving and so on. So these are the four things that are special about GIMF. Government, it's got a lot of instruments and so on. So you can have both government investment, which is productive investment that can raise the productivity of the private sector capital stock. And you can just have straight old wasteful government spending. Think of that as government consumption that doesn't really contribute to GDP. So it just effectively steals resources from the economy It doesn't contribute. Now, don't be afraid. Maybe you should be afraid. Um, uh, this is what the GIMP model looks like if there are two countries, home. So you'll see an HO in multiple places, starting at the very top, and you'll see RW on the other side of the page. So this reflects my methodology that I developed, where we think of models as onions and seeds. So the way that David Hendry, or actually the way I used to build models uh, back in the 1980s. So it's not like I rejected those crazy models because of the lack of trying to actually develop them. These are econometric models where people would estimate all these things, and then you put all the equations together, and then you ask, well, does it make any sense? And the answer is no. It never makes any sense. And so for this kind of model, we think of an onion and a seed. So the seed is like a model generator. Okay, so in this case, the seed is going to be, I type in home and RW, and I want with that seed to generate the structure of the code that would have two country model of the world, home and the rest of the world. Okay, so now, of course, if you wanted five countries, you type in United States, Canada, Euro area, Japan, China, and the rest of the world. Okay, that would be an example of a seed where you would generate the structure of the economy or all those economies that trade with each other. Okay, so this is going to be the major benefit from this kind of framework that basically it's analytically well it makes sense if economics is the study of agents, households, business, foreigners, government, and so on, and they're working in a world where there's markets, okay, where there are rigidities, nominal and real rigidities, is what economics is. The economics is not this David Hendry nonsense and Milbar nonsense where you're kind of connecting variables without actually thinking about economics. And so that's very important what we're doing here. So that's the seed. And so the seed idea is that you have code generators that generate models. So I'm going to be taking you through this weekend example of how we generate a three-country model for Armenia. Okay, so that you can look at tax reform in countries like Armenia. But we're going to be doing the same thing with a model where we have Japan, the Philippines, and the rest of the world. That's going to be some results that we show on March 5th. So we're working on that right now. This is going to be in the Charles Goodhart launch, where we're going to show some examples where you could have policies where you try to deal with the dwindling aging issue in Japan, and you do that by having a policy that brings in foreign workers and potentially technology, robots, and so on, or government infrastructure to basically facilitate um, uh, dealing with the aging crisis that's looming in countries like Japan and Korea and other countries that have very elderly and aging populations with some very serious issues, expenditure related issues about how you're going to care for this aging population in an environment where where interest rates could be potentially above the growth rate of the economy, or in the other uh, part of the world where interest rates are really low and the central bank is controlled, constrained by the effective war bound. Both are potentially problematic. That's what makes all this work very important for central banks and ministries of finance and and basically the financial stability authorities, whether or not they be the central bank or some other institution. So the economy, okay, so that's the seed part. So thinking of economies where you have programs, computer programs that generate any particular structure of economy that you're thinking about developing. And then the next thing is like an onion. So an onion has these layers. So anytime you're doing economics on this level, you want to make sure that you understand everything that's going on. And so, how do you do that? Well, you want to be able to peel back the layer of the onion to be able to understand things like, what are the long run comparative statics of the model, which we can study by looking at things like the analog steady state model, which we talked about earlier. We talked about stock flow relationships and so on. But in addition to that, when you have really complicated multi-country models, one wants to really truly understand, what are all the linkages and so on. And to do that, it's really powerful if you can just turn things off and turn them on. By considering, for example, a three-country model of the world versus something that's more elaborate and so on. Okay, so it is economics. I would describe it as DSGE economics. So there's going to be dynamic equations. We're going to have shocks, so it's stochastic in that sense, and it's general equilibrium. Uh, so I would say this stuff is compatible with what we describe as DSG economics, but has limitations for certain things, as we talked about in the previous lectures of the need for models with endogenous money creation in housing sectors and enough heterogeneity and so on. So this model is going to be more for bread and butter macro fiscal analysis and for the kinds of experiments that we're going to be doing for the Goodhart seminar on March 5th, where we look at some aging related issues and so on. So it's going to have overlapping generations, and it's going to allow us to look at issues like what happens if we bring in unskilled workers to help take care of the elderly, along with robots or technology to help them care for the elderly and so on. So what's the model? So at the top, you've got the households, HH, okay, and households are going to be broken into two types. There's going to be overlapping generation households. So these are going to be these guys with finite planning horizons and so on. And then they're going to be liquidity constrained or LIQ households. Now, both of those groups are going to supply labor. Now we're going to shoot all the way down to the bottom and see that labor is used by union sector. Okay, now down here. Okay, so up here we have households. They're going to demand consumption goods, and they're going to supply labor to a union. Okay, now you might wonder why. So when you look at this structure that we're looking at on the screen right now, there's a lot of modularity in the sense that you have these agents like unions that allow us to basically, again, mimic what I would describe as micro foundations. Okay, so sort of macro micro foundations where you effectively are just doing dynamic optimization theory. But how to do that? Well, if you get for example, a union to kind of represent you, it allows us to introduce some market power. And so this is all going to be based on Dixit, Stiglitz, aggregators, and so on, or what we refer to as monopolistic competition. And so this is just a way to bring in the idea uh, that there's market power. Uh, and this is actually this part of it I don't find. I mean, for some purposes, I'm okay with this, but it also allows us to a convenient way to put in sticky wages or sticky prices. You're going to see it. You're going to see it. You're going to see it in a bunch of places. Okay, so you're going to see sticky prices and sticky wages and in a bunch of places in the model, in the various sectors of the model. So so these unions are going to supply labor to a traded goods sector and a non-traded goods sector. Sorry, the traded goods sector is on the right. Is on the right. That's what the T is. Where we have the non-traded sector over here. You can see the traded sector is linked to the rest of the world. Okay, so that's why we call it traded, in the sense that it's going to use capital and domestic labor as well as inputs. And so you think of these as intermediate inputs from the rest of the world. In the model on March 5th, they're also going to import some foreign labor. So it's not just going to be domestic labor, but they can also get some labor from the rest of the world. Okay, and so basically, a firm that produces a tradable good can also export that good, okay, to foreign workers, or sorry, foreign countries. So the traded good, the good could be used and consumed domestically, or it could be consumed by foreign economies. Okay, and so there's some potential right at the very beginning of the process where these guys that produce traded goods are importing something, or they might be producing something and exporting something to the rest of the world. And these could be things like uh, intermediate inputs, okay, that are then used and bundled together with domestic resources to produce final consumption goods. Okay, so a good example would be like a car. Okay, we now have a global car market, and we saw that during the floods in Thailand, affected Japanese output. Why? Well, because they get some of their parts. So when you're producing things in a world that's completely integrated, you tend to produce the things in the places that are the cheapest. And that's the problem with that is that we call that global supply chains or regional supply chains, is that if something breaks in that supply chain, that can shut down the output of everything that's connected to it. So GIMP has this kind of structure where you can capture some of that trade in primary inputs or intermediate inputs like computer chips or cars and so on. But there's also trade in final or close to final consumption goods or investment goods. And so that's what it looks like. I'm not going to go through in the video when I get into the model and we get into the equations and stuff like that. I'm going to refer back to this slide, but it would be a waste of time for me to take you through it, other than to say that there's a lot of tricks here, um, uh, to put in things like sticky prices or investment costs or rigidities on the retail sector. It's like you to keep it modular, to keep it tractable. It's like you pass your goods to to another agent, and then the agent either has an adjustment cost for changing the quantity or for changing the price. Okay, so it's is that micro foundations? Well, it's a hell of a lot better than the old style reduced form econometric nonsense. But is it true micro foundations in the sense that we can connect, the wage and price setting behavior to how, to what motivates the data, or sorry, the wage and price setting behavior in the real world? It's not that. Most of the price and wage setting equations, not all of them, you just tack on a lagged inflation. And so the most vital parts for thinking about things like real monetary policy issues just to tack on. Okay, so that said, the economics is amazing. Okay, so but for a model like this, should you get involved in this? No. I would say to get trained to be able to operate on a model like this probably take you maybe 1 or 2 years to become an economist. I mean, you should become an economist before you get this model. You should be a very good economist. If you're a very good economist, you can become extremely skillful doing this kind of research with this type of sophistication. And you'd start to do things within a year and start to get good within a couple of years. But I've never seen anybody that wasn't an economist before they were introduced to a model like this that ever became an economist. This is way too complicated. It's a complete waste of time to try and teach someone that's not an economist with something as crazy as this. It's just too much for them to absorb. Okay, so let's talk about actually, let's talk about the results. I'm just going to go over the results again, the David Ricardo results. I can find them here. Okay, so these are the David Ricardo results. I'm going to do it this way because before I actually show you the equations, so I'm going to do that so you can see what's kind of wrong in infinite horizon representative agent models. And so we're actually doing this experiment that I talked about earlier. So you probably didn't get it the first time. And so let's see if you get it this time. So again, David Ricardo was very concerned. Okay. He wasn't Ricardian. He was very non-Ricardian. So he was very concerned about the government running deficits. In other words, having taxes lower than expenditures. And so this is an example of an experiment on a version of GIMF that includes the United States. Okay. And we're going to be comparing two models here. One is going to be an overlapping generations model like GIMF, where you have these non-Ricardian features. And the other one's going to be an infinite horizon representative agent model. And what we're going to show here is that we can get similar short run, very short run responses over, it depends on the horizon. So when I say that word, similar short run responses, I don't mean really, because they are different and they will differ depending on what the horizon of the tax cut is and stuff. But let's take an example. So on the top panel, unfortunately, my students, you got to know this frontwards and backwards. So on the very upper part, what you have is the tax rate on labor. Okay, and so what are we going to talk about here? We're going to consider basically a cut to the tax rate of 5 percentage points. Okay, and what effect is that going to have on the deficit. Now, in this case, we're going to call it the savings ratio, so the government saving ratio, but this effectively will be the deficit. And so you see that the deficit changes by about 2.5 percentage points. Okay. So why is that? Why is it changing by less than the uh, tax rate? And the answer is that labor is only a part of the economy. Uh, and so that change in the tax rate, it takes a larger change in the tax rate to affect the deficit to GDP ratio because you're not taxing everything in the economy. So we're taxing all of nominal GDP and not just labor income. Okay, that they'd be approximately the same thing, right? You tax out of nominal GDP, and if you change the tax revenues by 1% of GDP, then that would approximately change the deficit to GDP by 1 percentage points if nothing else changed. Okay, if that's what economists call ceteris paribus. Okay, so 2.5 percentage point, if you want to think of it in terms of the deficit to GDP ratio would be 2.5 percentage points higher. Okay, or the government balance. Okay, sometimes we use that word. Uh, and so the government balance would be 2.5 percentage points lower, or the government deficit would be 2.5. Okay, so this has a tax reaction function in it that stabilizes the debt to GDP ratio. So you can see it's stabilizing. It looks like it's almost around 15 percentage points of GDP. It's going to be permanently higher. Well, that meant, as I said, um, to stabilize the debt process, there's going to be higher interest payments associated with that debt. So that means that tax rates are going to have to be higher at some point. Okay. So the reason you need these higher tax rates is because the interest payments on this debt are going to be higher. Okay. So the only way you're going to stabilize the debt process is if you make sure that you have a government surplus in this case that's sufficient to basically pay the interest obligations on this. So how do you do that? You have higher taxes in the long run. Now, the US economy, because the US economy is a major economy in the world, a change in the saving rate of the private sector in the US economy is going to change the global saving rate. So in a non-Ricardian world where people are not cutting back, they're not increasing their saving one for one with the reduction in government saving. So in this non-Ricardian world, the real interest rate has to rise, okay, to equilibrate the economy because there's this tendency for excessive consumption because of the lower taxes. So how does that work for a single country, a little country? It would just mean a real exchange rate depreciation if you could borrow and lend at an unchanged real interest rate. But for an economy as large as the United States, a change in its saving rate will affect the world saving rate. And so, in a world of integrated capital markets and modern financial systems, the real interest rate in the world has to rise. So that means the US real interest rate is going to have to rise by the same amount when you have integrated capital markets in the long run. So you see the real interest rate in the US and in the world rises by about, just under 60 basis points or 0.6, which means 60 basis points or 0.6 of a percentage point. Okay, so the other thing is you can see that that basically private saving ratio does rise, okay, but does not rise as much, okay, as basically the government savings falls. And as a result of that, the US runs what some people describe as not a not a twin deficit, but an almost twin deficit in the sense that you can see the current account deficit down here rises by about 0.4 percentage points. Okay, because the real interest rate is adjusting for the world. Okay, in a case where you have a big economy like the U.S., you'll observe it both in terms of the current account deficit and in terms of the increase in the world real interest rate. So, and so now in your representative agent model, again, I mean, you can't really do serious fiscal policy or lots of types of analysis in an infinite representative agent model because in those models, you totally ignore all this stuff and start off almost actually like David Hendry methodology, where you think about the long run and think about cycles. And so I'm pretty sure James Tobin, one of the guys that works with me, Giannis Elikias, studied under James Tobin and Franco Modigliani. And so anytime I have a question about what would James Tobin think about something, I ask Giannis, and he actually will tell me what James Tobin would think about this. But in many of my encounters, either reading James Tobin or actually listening to him talk, he would not be very impressed with these infinite horizon representative agent models because for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. But he once said something very profound in a lecture, saying, "I've never met um, a long run comparative static that was independent of the tension in the dynamics," which is basically what I said earlier. So this style of modeling, where you kind of think about the long run and you layer stuff on, it's just not appropriate when we think about issues like fiscal policy that fundamentally are these intertemporal problems. Like, do I party today and have a hangover in the future? In other words, do I run deficits today, spend a lot, and do I have to pay for that in the future? Which you will have to do if the interest rate's above the growth rate of the economy. Or can I just ignore all that stuff and then just think about, cycles around some trend equilibrium thing, like in the Mundell-Fleming model or those types of models? And I think the answer is that for some questions, it's okay. But for some questions, just totally crazy to think that way. And this is an example with fiscal policy that I can't, if I ask the same question, what if the government ran deficits in an infinite horizon representative agent model? Okay, that assumed um, that basically I could borrow and lend this, at this interest rate in the world and stuff, and I just pre-assigned some equilibrium notion that the current account deficit has to be zero. That basically some crazy function would change, usually, and in this case, a country risk premium function that ensures that the current account mechanically goes back to some number. That's not economics. That's a disaster. Thinking about many economic questions using that kind of model and so on. So these are just the other variables to understand what's going on here. So in the non-Ricardian model, this model with over 11 generations, you can see that if there's an increase in government debt of looks like about 13 percentage points up here, 13 percentage points up here after 50 years, okay, that would, the net foreign liability to GDP ratio is up by about 10 percentage points. Okay, um, so basically, the increase in the real interest rate is basically, uh, resulting in some of the adjustment from deficits that would normally, in a very small economy like Armenia or Georgia, they were thinking about doing a very small fiscal expansion. That in that case, there's going to be more of a one-to-one relationship between things like net foreign liabilities and debt because they're not affecting the world saving rate and not affecting the interest rate and so on. So this is really important. This one thing should be worth its weight in gold because if one thinks that before the global financial crisis, um, we were in full employment, and today we are in full employment. And in between those 2 points, we had the global financial crisis and the fight to eliminate massive amounts of unemployment in the economy. But we had only closed the output gap or reduced unemployment just before COVID. And then COVID happens. And now, of course, we think that we're back into a world where there's at least full employment in the advanced economies. And if you believe that, and you believe the economics in overlapping generation models like what we're talking about on the screen, because we had such a massive increase in world government debt since, like, we used fiscal aggressively during the global financial crisis and we used it super aggressively during COVID. So we might have much higher levels of world public debt. So Hamid Farouque, um, uh, 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 HICAS, Gitzian, and I basically went back. Olivier Blanchard asked us to do this work and to compute using these kinds of models how much the world real interest rate would have increased because of the increase in world government debt. And you can see from this calculation, right here, for a 13 percentage point increase in government debt raises the world real interest rate by 60 basis points. So the U.S. wasn't the only country in the world, to increase government debt. It increased a lot in the U.S., but but the rest of the world also had fairly large increases in government debt. So world government debt has probably raised the real short-term interest rate um, somewhere between 1 and 200 basis points. And I think um, Olivier Blanchard is right that there might be some forces that are like aging that are also driving the world interest rate down. But I think we have to worry about this one because I think we're much more confident about these kind of calculations. He has no calculations about what he's talking about. He has no quantitative measures of how much the world real interest rate has declined or what it actually is. So he's effectively storytelling about the downward trend. This is why we're getting into this research, is that we need to have models and ways of quantifying these things. Okay, so I kind of showed you that. Now I'm gonna basically just show you the nasty looking equations. So I showed you this, and that wasn't nasty enough. Here's what discrete time dynamic optimization looks like. So by discrete time, it just means that in the early work by Olivier Blanchard and the JPE, as well as the work by Hamid and I, we did everything with continuous time, which just makes the, the equations look a lot nicer. But I'm not gonna. I'm going to get into these equations when we get into the technical parts, when we're actually looking at the code on the computer, because I think for most of you, uh, you actually won't get into the model um, when you're a level one economist, but when you specialize to get to level two, where you have to show some really high research output, some of you might have projects that are related to DSG economics. Well, it'll all be related to DSG economics, but some of them might require this kind of style of modeling and so on. Okay, so consumption of the what we describe as the overlapping generation agents. Uh, there's going to be three things that are going to be driving it: financial wealth, and so that's the FW. Household wealth, uh, and we're going to think about that when it's derived from labor income. So that's what the L is going to be. And then there's going to be household wealth that's going to be in the form of capital. And so that's a little bit different than multi-mod. So I'd like you to go to the multi-mod website. There's a wonderful multi-mod website where you can see all the equations and everything. And there we think of financial wealth as being uh, the value of the capital stock, okay, and bonds, okay, and then human wealth, okay, and I think uh, uh, this way is because of the type of micro foundations that we're trying to put into it, and because we want to make sure that that basically we also had myopia, that we had the firms in the economy acting also myopically, and the argument is that they're representing um, the households that own them. Okay, so if there's myopia in the household uh, decision making, why would there be myopia in the businesses that they own, and so on? So this is just a neat little trick for introducing myopia. Now, so let's talk about it. So the first thing is financial wealth, and so financial wealth uh, is going to depend on bonds. That's okay. So this is this B thing, as well as the net foreign asset position. Okay, so bonds are going to be assumed to roll over. So the bond is only going to be a one period bond, so it's not going to be very realistic in that way. So you have to be careful about it in that way, because in the real world, um, there's usually a maturity structure to bonds, but in DSG models, are usually that complexity is usually ignored. And then there's going to be this internationally traded bond, F, and so this is the net foreign assets. And so you can see that um, uh, this ET thing is the exchange rate, and so that's what is going to convert all these bonds into domestic currency. So that's going to be financial wealth. Two types of financial wealth: domestic bonds, B, or government debt, which the government's going to issue, and then net foreign assets, F hat. Okay, so human wealth. Um, it is the next equation, and you can see that it is a, a dynamic equation that effectively says that human wealth is the discounted value of future after tax labor income. Okay, so that W is the wage that W had, uh, and and N is the labor, and so on, and tau is the tax rate on. Okay, so that looks pretty intuitive. When you take a discounted value of that, and again, not just discounted at the interest rate, but with this additional myopia term. It's going to turn out to be a very simple equation that just says HWT is equal to my income today plus a parameter times my human wealth T plus one. And so that's what this term is here. And so you can see that that the interest rate is in it, the R thing, but there's also this theta that enters in a very similar way to the interest rate because it's a discount rate. Think of it as the probability of biological death. Okay, so I'll be facing the future stream of income, but I may think I'm going to die. Okay, so if I think that there's a 10% chance that I'm going to die, then I don't really care about things 20 years into the future. So even though I might get some income, might expect to get some income 20 years in the future, if I don't care about my future generations and I think I'm going to die within 10 years, then I'm not going to take into consideration anything after 10 years. So it's going to create a bigger discount rate, this probability of biological death. Now, in the real world, and when one thinks about behavior in the real world, there's nothing in any way non-copacetic with assuming that this is the probability of economic death. In other words, you can just use this parameter to calibrate the model to reflect much, I think, more deeply rooted behavior that people are even more myopic. Some people just don't act in a way that's consistent with them caring much beyond 5 years, for example, and so on. And so, so it's easy if you subscribe to that empirical evidence about consumption behavior for you to introduce a lot more myopia through this theta G thing. Now, you'll also notice there's a human wealth thing, okay, for capital. And again, because we're assuming that these households own the firms, they then get transfers basically from the firm. So you can think of them as dividend payments. Okay, just like you get labor income, you get a flow of dividend income. So you think of that as, when you get old, okay, you take your wealth and you might turn it into an annuity. So you just get a payment from that. And so the question is if it's just a way of introducing myopia into the firm decision and that's just based on experience that in these models, when we put myopia in the household sector, we didn't put it in the behavior of firms. You get very strange, peculiar results that didn't make any sense. So there's a lot of research in like there's like because of all the efforts that we put into building these models, there's an incredible amount of knowledge that went into kind of looking at things in the real world and looking at available empirical evidence and then thinking about these things. And the people that were involved in it were incredibly bright. Like I had some of the brightest people involved in these models. Mika Kortelainen, who is someone that is another guy like Ben Hunt. Mika was a bit more of a modeler than Ben Hunt, but he also shared the real world kind of perspective about how to use these models. One day, Olivier Blanchard met my division, and he asked a question: how long does it take to do a simulation. And Mika went something like, well, it takes uh, a few minutes to do a simulation on one of these gigantic models with thousands of equations and stuff. But then it takes several days to decide if it makes any sense or not. And Olivier liked that answer, that when we think about using these models, and when he was there, we used them extensively, thinking through all kinds of issues, but it wasn't kind of take the model and take the result kind of thing. They're, just like simple models are used to focus one's mind on what is important. Okay. Uh, these kinds of models can be used like simple models for helping us to think about questions and various mechanisms and so on. So there you have it in a nutshell. I seem to be having an issue here. Okay, now, so so you can also study fiscal policy rules in GIMP. Okay, so you can consider all different kinds of things. And this, of course, is going to be an area of very hot research now, that just like it was a hot research in the 1980s when the interest rate was above the growth rate of the economy. This is when I really started doing this research in the 1980s, when in some sense it's all been kind of reborn and will be reborn if Larry Summers and I are right that the interest rate's above the growth rate. It'll still be reborn in Olivier Blanchard's world. Uh, but the problem will be unstable fiscal dynamics because the interest rate's higher than the growth rate of the economy. In his world, it will be because of deflation economics and the study of depression. So, but fiscal rules have to exist in worlds where the interest rate's above the growth rate. These are examples of, for example, a structural surplus rule, like what we applied to understand Chile and so on. But you can know all kinds of things. You can study debt stabilization, and you can even think of fiscal rules that have better design, countercyclical fiscal policy. So when one looks at fiscal policy, it's kind of sad in the sense that it's just total hysteresis that a country in most cases will just have a fiscal regime, and there won't be a lot of thought that went into the design of that. It will just be you accept, you inherit something, and maybe you adjust it, but it's not a rational process. It's not a well thought out process. Now, I will say that the parliamentary democracies, so I'm thinking, for example, like Canada, for example, has very low debt, government debt to GDP ratio. So when I talk to my friends in Canada, they're always complaining about fiscal policy and stuff, but they do have a low government debt to GDP ratio. They did at one point have very unstable debt dynamics. So during the period of disinflation, it wasn't until years after we had adopted an inflation target, it wasn't until basically the federal government had balanced the budget and actually completely reformed the structure of government so that it was stable and didn't distort the economy nearly so badly. But it wasn't until then that we eliminated the country risk premium. So we used to have long-term interest rates about 100, even larger relative to the United States, when in fact we had a monetary policy regime that had delivered inflation that was comparable, maybe even better than the United States for we had flexible exchange rates since the early 1970s and so on. And so, but there was this kind of lingering problem with this country risk premium. And it wasn't until we actually balanced the federal budget and put government debt, you know, back in the closet, so to speak. Uh, but if you actually look at government debt in Canada right now, it doesn't it you know they have government debt GDP ratio that is substantial, what I would regard as being consistent with safe. Now they have a lot of issues, maybe in provincial governments and so on. That so I don't want to discount what the issues with government debt are, and future entitlements, promises that governments have made to the population, partly take care of aging people. But basically you can look at fiscal rules and so on. Now, another thing that I'm going to talk about uh, is the effects of fiscal stimulus in structural models. So when I was at the IMF, I got the idea of calling up all my friends in the modeling community for us to do all these standardized fiscal experiments and so on. And this was very helpful. One thing is there is no such thing as a fiscal multiplier. Um, the multiplier will depend on the length of time that the fiscal measure is being introduced. Um, what was the monetary policy response? So, in other words, does the central bank welcome the expansionary fiscal policy like it did during the global financial crisis, or um, or does it raise interest rates because the economy is maybe already overheating and so on? So, what happens to the economy depends to a large extent on what fiscal policy is trying to achieve and whether or not monetary policy is trying to achieve similar objectives, like maybe reducing unemployment and so on. But when the economy is overheating and fiscal is too expansionary, then obviously the central bank will be raising interest rates to deal with the inflation. So pretty common sense because it's global integrated monetary fiscal. You'll have all those insights, which can be useful. Obviously, will be very dependent on the economic structure of the economy. So economies that are open will have import leakages. So just standard practical things. And what we did in this model comparison exercise was that we looked at the results of the United States and Europe. So they became our kind of benchmark. So these are large economy cases, but if you were so interested, the GFS, we're going to teach all of our students how to calibrate a version of the model for the economy that they follow. So when you become a global forecasting school student, you have to focus on the US up to what we describe as 0.6. So you have up to 1 year to achieve level one, and for level 0.2, 0.4, and 0.6, that's all work on the United States. But at the very beginning, you have to, when you join the GFS, you have to decide, am I going to be a Euro area specialist economy, in which case, to achieve level one, you'd have to do US up to 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, and then you jump to the Euro area. So you'd have to understand how to think about fiscal policy in a structured way. And the structured way is to look at it through the lens of a DSG model. But in addition, of course, you have to understand all the practical aspects of fiscal policy and so on. So what do we look at? These are some examples of temporary changes in fiscal instruments. So think of this as something that you might use like during the global financial crisis. During the global financial crisis, the IMF in the G20 recommended a 2% fiscal expansion in 2009 and another 2 in 10. Okay, and that's almost exactly what we got. The recommendation was if you can do more than two, if you have more fiscal space, do more. And of course, countries that had automatic stabilizers like Europe did less, and that was okay. But what we actually got was approximately 2% in 2009 for the G20 as a whole, and 2% in 2010. You can find the results of this. We published it in the Journal of Monetary Economics using GIMP to which is the model we're actually using in real time to coordinate the fiscal expansion in the G20 to kind of save the world from potentially a Great Depression, I would argue. And so when you look at the multipliers, we do them both with financial accelerators and without. We show that when monetary policy accommodates, welcomes the fiscal expansion, and the G20 does it all together, that they obviously don't lose import leakages in this case because they're all doing it together. So any import leakages that one country loses, another country will benefit from. So if they all sing together, the fiscal multiplier will be larger. And that message came through loud and clear among the G20. And of course, central banks, because they were trying to support the economy because they double-digit unemployment and looming depression on the horizon, joined the crowd to deliver approximately about a 2% fiscal expansion in 2009 and 2% in 2010. So we looked at it. The size of the shock was basically 1% of GDP. Okay, so that was all standardized across the models, and we did either a 1 year fiscal expansion or a 2 year. So remember, 2009, it was 2 years, 9 and 10, and so you can ask, what are the effects of those fiscal expansions? And so, of course, it depends on the instrument that was used. And in GIMP, we have a pretty rich assortment of instruments. It can be government consumption. Again, this is not productive government absorption by assumption in the model. So it goes into, it's part of GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the G is there, government absorption, but it doesn't enter into the productivity of the economy. So it only enters into productivity of the economy if it's government investment, in which case it could be things like government infrastructure and so on that raises the productivity of domestic capital and so on. There's also possibility of lump sum transfers. And so this is just where you give people, give everybody the same, give everybody $1, okay, that you don't discriminate in some way, which is possible, right? But you can also have lump sum transfers targeted to these hand-to-mouth consumers, which again consume directly out of their disposable income, so they spend it all. So if you could differentiate between those types of people in the population, of course you can't. If you could, then I'm sure the U.S. Treasury wouldn't have done quite the fiscal expansion they did. So the reason they did such a broad fiscal expansion is to make sure they didn't miss anybody. So people that even made incomes, that didn't need the money, got big fiscal transfers from the government because they didn't want to miss out on anybody. Of course, it'll just be taxed back. Um, so don't spend it if you don't need it because higher taxes are coming. Okay, so labor tax revenue, which is going to be distortionary. So in the model, you have to pay people to work, and they work on the basis of their after-tax wage. So we can also consider a change in the tax rate on labor, cut in labor taxes, consumption taxes, and corporate income taxes. So there's a whole bunch of different instruments. What are the institutions that participated with the European Commission? This was under Werner Ruger and Jan Infeld, okay, uh, that I think are some of the best modelers in the world. Of course, the IMF team. So I had both my GIMF team and my FSGM team participating. The Board of Governors, they had two models. I believe one was from the international group and the other one was from the domestic, the OECD and the Bank of Canada. So those are the institutions in the world that, uh, that are into these models. I wouldn't even say the OECD is into it. They're not in the same league as these other guys. And I think some of the one of the Fed models probably infinite horizon, representative agent stuff. Okay, but six DSG models, all models are structural. Three are multi-region. Two of them are two regions, and two are single countries. Okay, so I would say it's really the IMF team that would have, been doing the major multi-country models. So obviously, the multipliers are very sensible. Fiscal stimulus has an important role to play, particularly when you're in a low inflation environment like 2009 and so on. And so fiscal policy was really important. Monetary policy, when we studied monetary policy in all these models, played a very important role in terms of determining what the short run multipliers are. It also played a very important role in the empirical research by Daniel Lay, Pescatori, and I'm really sorry for forgetting the third person on that team. One of the most amazing research teams that I've had the privilege of coordinating. In fact, it was such a good research team that almost no coordination was required. But they did this empirical work applying the Romer historical narrative approach to fiscal policy, but did it in a multi-country setting. So this all came out in the World Economic Outlook. I feel so bad by not remembering the last co-author, but effectively it was led by Daniel Lay, Pescatori, and this other guy that I feel really badly that I forgot his name. But they did this, Herculean effort to basically apply Romer and Romer's historical narrative approach. And one of the key things is that when you looked at the fiscal measures that were introduced and classified them by reason so that you could get truly kind of exogenous shocks so that you can measure fiscal multipliers. It got broadly the same kinds of results as what we get from this DSG economic stuff. And that's not kind of surprising because you've got a guy like Ben Hunt and myself that we're not letting these modelers just off do a bunch of willy-nilly and stuff. We're spending days, weeks, I'd say even months, years, making sure they don't produce anything nonsensical, which of course they did. If you just let them to their own to their own devices. If they didn't have the experience, if they could only do the math and they couldn't do the economics and the empirics, they would produce nonsense and so on. So it's because of Ben Hunt and people at the commission, I would say, that basically had to deal with real world people. So their models would obviously be consistent with the empirical evidence and using those models in a real environment. So you look at increasing government investment with no monetary accommodation. And again, the shock is 1% of GDP, right? So just say, very common sense, back of the envelope calculation. If you have a shock to G remember GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And if you have a shock to G, that's 1% of GDP, and C doesn't change, and I doesn't change, but only G changes, and X doesn't change, and M doesn't change, it means that GDP should be up by 1%. Okay, so you can say, well, that was ceteris paribus. I should be getting 1% because of the direct effect of G on expenditures or aggregate demand. Okay, so if you think of GDP as being aggregate demand determined, okay, then it would be 1%. So the question would be then, is it bigger than that or smaller than that? And so you can see in some of the models, when you don't have any monetary accommodation, in other words, when you'd be raising interest rates, you're going to get approximately 1%. Okay, now this is partly because it's government investment, which is assumed to be productive. Okay, so that's part of the reason why the output effect can be a little bit bigger and so on, because it's government investment. Now, if you have 1 year of monetary accommodation, what we mean by that is that the central bank doesn't raise the interest rate. Okay, and this would be very much like in 2009, right? Like we wanted the fiscal expansion. We wanted it in categories that would have big multipliers because we're trying to save the economy from a Great Depression. We had double-digit unemployment in the United States in 2009. And so obviously the central bank the Fed's not going to raise the interest rate as well as the fiscal expansion. When the fiscal expansion raises aggregate demand, that's going to be a little bit inflationary. Okay, if the central bank, that increase in demand is going to cause an increase in inflation. And if the central bank doesn't change the interest rate, it means the real interest rate is going to go down, which means that now you'll have a multiplier effect. So the increase in government expenditures of 1% of GDP now could raise output by more than 1% because of this low real interest rate stimulating. Okay, so this would be an example of a high multiplier fiscal instrument. If you look at other fiscal instruments, or you look at the degree of persistence in the fiscal instruments, you get different answers and so on. So I'm not going to go through each one of those today, but what I'm going to do is just leave it there, saying the fiscal instruments will be dramatically different. So for something like government expenditures, it'll be high because you're spending, buying things or buying labor, services, and so on. So that's quite a bit different than giving transfers to the population, much of which will be saved, and so on. So the multipliers will be much, much lower there. When we did the work on 2009, 2010 on the fiscal expansion of the G20, it was a combination of things. So while you would like the fiscal expansion in such times to be on government investment. It was only China, places like China um, that could use government investment because it was in the business of developing infrastructure and stuff like that. So it could vary the speed of its infrastructure spending. And advanced economies getting investment infrastructure projects up and running takes time, and it's more complicated in advanced economies that are mature, where there's a lot of I know in Fairfax, Virginia, where I lived, there was a road on the way to the IMF that I used to have to drive every day, and the road was on what we call the Beltway, and so I had to pass by what is called Route 95 going south to Florida. And then on that exchange, people would do studies and say, well, we could make it 3 times bigger. We could layer, stack them all up. And even if we did that, nothing really would happen to traffic congestion, because all it would do is just take all the traffic where there was already traffic congestion and just pile it up in this spot. And so when we did infrastructure spending, it increased in the short run the amount of time that it took to get to work, like increase things like delivery times in the area around us. And at the end of the day, they decided just to add a couple lanes, uh, uh, because they're also concerned about the environment and that much traffic, going through our neighborhood. So I was kind of happy about that, but very very unhappy that government infrastructure, well, in the models, are assumed to increase the productivity of the private sector right away in the real world. Again, that's an assumption in these models that needs to be tamed, and but can be tamed easily. So in GIMP, for example, it's relatively easy to have a delay and even an adjustment cost from infrastructure. So all these things, if they have an experienced economist driving the car, it can be a great car. Okay, but if you give this to this kind of machine to a rookie, you'll get trash. So that I think I'll leave it at there, and 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 hopefully the students got something useful out of that.